Hi, good evening. I'm Michael Buckley with the Bright Focus Foundation. I'd like to welcome you tonight and introduce our President and CEO of Bright Focus, Stacy Haller.
Good evening. It is a real pleasure for Bright Focus to be a new partner with the Helen Keller Foundation to award the Helen Keller Prize for Vision Research. For those of you who may not know, Bright Focus is an organization that funds research worldwide to end diseases of mind and sight. We have 3 programs: macular degeneration, glaucoma, and Alzheimer's. And we work every day with many of you and scientists around the globe on about 150 projects to do our part in helping to end these diseases. Since inception, we've given more than $163 million in awards around the globe. We are so very proud to be a sponsor of the Helen Keller Prize for 2 very important reasons that we became involved. One, to celebrate amazing scientific accomplishment that will change our lives today and years to come. And equally importantly, Bright Focus is committed to raising the visibility of the importance of vision research and the role that all of you play every day in that process. And to that end, on June 9th, we are very proud to announce that in Washington, D.C., we are going to re-award the Helen Keller Prize for Vision Research at the U.S. Institute of Peace with 250 to 300 people in Washington, D.C., across from the Lincoln Memorial, who probably have never heard of the prize unless they're connected in this community. And there'll be members of Congress, philanthropists, members from government who well know all of you in this important work, as well as people of influence and affluence. And we hope that's the start of a journey that raises the profile and celebrates this important recognition. And with that, I'd like to say thank you and introduce Dr. Morris.
Thanks, Stacy, and thank you all for coming. I think it was about 1993 that Chris Patterson and I were in China and were overnighting on the way out, and he asked me what the Helen Keller Foundation wanted to do. And one of the things I told him was we wanted to establish an award in Helen Keller's name. And he said, well, there's lots of awards. And I said, yes, but there's not a Helen Keller Award. And his face kind of lit up, and he said, you mean the Nobel Prize of Vision? And I said, yeah, that's what I had in mind. It's not that, but the partnership with Bright Focus is a baby step in that direction. But first, it had to be an award of the vision research community. And the prize selection committee, the various chairmen, Chris Patterson, Tom Zimmerman, Ron Smith, and Sheila West, and all the august members have made it that. And I want to thank Laura Beckwith for shepherding this the whole 20-something years. Thank you. And now Sheila West is going to talk to you about the committee and so forth.
Well, welcome everyone to this wonderful space for our dinner tonight. We're certainly very proud of our laureate this evening. I'd like to begin by answering the phone over here. So, by acknowledging the members of the prize selection committee. They worked tirelessly. We had an unprecedented number of applications this time. It was indeed difficult, but they really pulled a lot of work on the day that we met, and we're pleased to say we're going forward. And if they are in the room, I'd like them to stand up. Bronwyn Bateman, Alan Bird, Carlos Belmonte, Nick Delamere, Joe Hollyfield, Lois Smith, Joel Schumann, Al Summer, and especially Chris Patterson. Now, actually, I was going to ask Chris to come up here because this is a very, very special man who, as you said, was at the beginning of the development of the prize, served as co-chair of this committee up until this year when I had some very, very wonderful shoes to fill. And so, Chris, because you are such an architect and you wrote so much about this prize, we would like to present you with a token of our gratitude for all of your hard work for this committee. So if you would come up and accept this on behalf of the committee, we would be so pleased. And then I would also like the laureates from the past to also stand up if they are here. You know who you are. I see Emily and Rick over there. Yes, let's acknowledge them as well. And now it gives me great pleasure to introduce a man that I have followed his career throughout Arvo, has always been a real hero in terms of vision science. Dr. Gene Anderson with the D. McGee Eye Institute, University of Oklahoma, and he will be introducing our laureate for this evening. Gene, if you would come up and do that. Gene and I go back to fighting over the move out of Sarasota, so which I clearly lost.
Those were the fun days. What a great week. I mean, we had a Arvo Foundation event on Saturday night that was terrific. And yesterday I had the privilege of introducing one of my dear friends, Joe Bishars, who got the Proctor Medal. And tonight I have the privilege of talking a little bit about another dear friend, Dean Bach. I met Dean in 1969 when I was just starting and he was just starting, and I went out to UCLA to learn how to do some things, autoradiography. He had just published this wonderful paper in the Journal of Molecular Biology in 1969. It was Michael Hall, Dean Bach, and Alf Bacharach, and it had beautiful, beautiful EM autoradiography. And I challenge anybody to bring me a paper that has better EM autoradiography than that 1969 paper. Dean, as you all know, has a terrific career in science. So I thought I would tell you a little bit about the Dean Bach that some of you may not be so familiar with. He was born in Douglas County, South Dakota. The nearest town was 6 miles away, so he was born at home. The nearest hospital was 35 miles away. His father was a first-generation immigrant in 1926 from Holland, and his mother had also come from the Netherlands, her family, a few generations beforehand. Dean has 2 sisters and 1 brother. This is a picture of Dean and his elder sister on his maternal grandparents' farm. This was in 1940. He quickly learned what farming was all about. His father used horsepower when horsepower wasn't used to describe internal combustion engines, but to describe, 2 horses, 3 horses pulling the plows. He quickly learned to work. I mean, in those days, this is a real picture of Dean at age 6, running that John Deere thrashing machine, running the oats from the thrashing machine to the granary. And by the time he was 10, he was driving the car on public roads. In those days, they didn't really require a driver's license. Dean went to a 1-room elementary school. I didn't circle him. I think you can pick him out. He has the most piercing eyes in the bunch. For those of you who can't quite make it out, he's the young man sitting in the middle with his hair. He had a lot of hair there, Dean. Hair all in place. And he graduated from high school at age 16. his high school class had 39 students. Here he is, the handsome fella. He went to Calvin College, which is a private, excellent liberal arts college in Michigan, and took his first job as a high school science teacher in Cerritos, California. Dean and I have a history going back in mathematics. I occasionally give him a lecture in statistics. And I did so one time in a review of his paper. He knew exactly who had reviewed it and called me up and said, "What the hell are you doing?" I said, "Well, I'm trying to teach you statistics." So his aversion to mathematics goes way back, and rather than teach mathematics at this high school, he resigned. He entered graduate school. That was the best thing that happened to the world when Dean decided to go to graduate school. He got his master's at California State and, of course, his PhD at UCLA. Along the way, he met Audrey Van Diest. In 1961, they were married in 1964, just before he entered graduate school at UCLA School of Medicine. Audrey's father had a dairy out in the valley and other land, and he raised alfalfa and things, but he had this huge dairy, and the dairy had a drive-through place where people could drive through and buy milk. And his daughters worked in that, and Audrey was working selling milk to people who would drive through. And Dean drove through one time to buy some milk, and he saw Audrey, and he was smitten. And that boy drank more milk that summer. And he ultimately, obviously, persuaded Audrey to go out with him, and that led to a terrific love that persists to this day. Because of those unusual circumstances, and there being Dutch, of course, there's this famous Dutch painter, Vermeer, who had a painting called The Milkmaid. So because of the circumstances of their meeting and their Dutch heritage, we affectionately refer to Audrey as the Milkmaid. Dean and Audrey were blessed with 3 sons. Here their picture on a vacation in 1984. Unfortunately, Jonathan was taken from them in a tragic accident. But they have 2 daughters by marriage, 4 grandchildren, and they have had just a wonderful time with their children. This is Jeremy and wife Cynthia with 2 daughters, Sasha and Tatiana, who are here at the table. The other son is James and his wife Stacy, their son Jack and daughter Zoe. Dean has received a tremendous number of academic honors, and these are just some of them. He's a teacher extraordinaire. Anybody who has ever sat through a scientific meeting where Dean made a presentation and he described the complement system and how it works and how it is involved in AMD, you just sit there and marvel. There's nobody else in the world who could do it quite like he does. And he's been honored with the UCLA Alumni Association Distinguished Teaching Award. He got the Dolly Green Endowed Chair. He was one of the younger members to get the Jonas Friedenwald Award at Arvo for his seminal work on broad outer segment renewal. His colleges, Calvin College's Distinguished Alumnus Award, California State University at Long Beach, the Alcon Award, RPB Senior Scientific Award, the Paul Kaiser International Award in Retinal Research, FFB's Liggett Gunn Lifetime Achievement Award, and finally, the culmination of his terrific career is the Helen Keller Prize. Dean's hobbies, he's returned to his roots. He does quote-unquote farming in South Dakota. He likes to garden. He likes desert camping. Matt LaVale and I had the privilege of going with him one time along with Wayne Hubble to the desert. Those were terrific times, and he loves restoring old cars. This is his vision of farming. Driving this four-wheeler with some people there. I think you may see Greg Hegeman there and perhaps Peter Dudley. And who's the other one, Dean? That's it. No, there's 4 people there, you know. Didn't I tell you, mathematics was never his strong suit. I thought it was one of Dean's brothers. Oh, boy. You know, it couldn't have worked out better, you know. And he also loves to restore old cars. He's a Mustang addict, and he recently completed this restoration. This is especially memorable to him because this was Jonathan's 1966 2+2 Mustang Fastback. It was restored in his memory. So anybody with an old Mustang in your garage and you need it restored, check in with Dean. He has some time on his hands now. Well, I hope I've given you a little side of Dean that some of you may not have known. And I'll stop there and say it's my pleasure to introduce Keller Johnson Thompson, who will make the introduction of Dean Bach. Keller is the great-grandniece of Helen Keller. She's Vice President of Education of the Helen Keller Foundation.
Thank you. That might be a tough act to follow. It was great. Thank you. When the wellspring of possibility rained down upon her, the pebble on the pond of what can be made an everlasting ripple. When all around her said an ordinary life would be impossible, Helen Keller agreed. She was anything but ordinary. Helen Keller was not only interested in the welfare of blind and visually impaired persons in the United States, but she was also interested in those in other countries. Helen's ability to empathize with the individual citizen in need, as well as her ability to work with world leaders to shape global policy on vision loss, made her a supremely effective ambassador for disabled persons worldwide. During 7 trips between 1946 and 1957, she visited 35 countries on 5 continents. She met with world leaders such as Winston Churchill, Nehru, and Golda Meir. In 1948, she was sent to Japan as America's ambassador by General Douglas MacArthur. Her visit was a huge success. Up to 2 million Japanese people came out to see her, and her appearance drew considerable attention to the plight of Japan's blind and disabled population. In 1955, when she was 75 years old, she embarked on one of her longest and most grueling journeys, a 40,000-mile, 5-month tour of Asia. Wherever she traveled, she brought encouragement to millions of blind people, and many of the efforts to improve conditions for those with vision loss outside the United States can be traced directly to her visits. Helen was famous from the age of 8 to her death in 1968. Her wide range of political, cultural, and intellectual interests and activities ensured that she knew people in all spheres of life. She counted leading personalities of the late 19th and early 20th century among her friends and acquaintances. These included Eleanor Roosevelt, Will Rogers, Albert Einstein, Ilma Goldman, Charlie Chaplin, President John F. Kennedy, Andrew Carnegie, Henry Ford, Dwight Eisenhower, among others. She was honored around the globe and garnered many awards, as she was one of the first 30 people to receive the United States Presidential Medal of Freedom. As a name that is known worldwide, Helen Keller is a symbol of courage and hope. Yet, she is much more than a name and a symbol. She was a woman of outstanding intelligence, unwavering determination, unbelievable courage, and insurmountable achievement. Tonight, we continue her legacy and her hope to hasten the day when there shall be no preventable blindness. Without further ado, it is my honor and privilege to present to you the 2016 Helen Keller Prize for Vision Research Laureate, Dr. Dean Bach. Dr. Bach. This time, I will present Dr. Bach with the Helen Keller Medallion. And also, Dr. Bach, we have for you an unrestricted honorarium. Thank you so much and congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you so much. When I met Keller Thompson Johnson this morning, having looked at this marvelous book that she sent to me a couple of weeks ago called From Her Mind to Your Mind, I saw Helen Keller's face. Helen Keller was a beautiful woman, and I encourage all of you to get a copy of this book and educate yourself on the extraordinary accomplishments of this amazing woman. She was the ultimate, really, in faith, insight, compassion, tolerance, eloquence, persistence. Mark Twain and Albert Einstein gave her their highest accolades, as did many around the world, not only emperors, kings, presidents, but of course, the people who'd lost their sight and their hearing. I am so honored to follow in the footsteps of many people in this room. Emily Chu, Rick Ferris, Gordon Legg, Bob Massoff, L. Summer, and I was going to recognize John Dowling as well, but unfortunately John couldn't join us because he attended a wedding of one of his children in Jamaica, I believe, and came down with a respiratory illness and wasn't able to attend. And unfortunately for those who were going to have him auctioned off for 30 minutes of quality time at Arvo, you're going to have to wait until next time. It's a real shame because John is a real icon, as all of you know, I'm sure. Helen Keller not only mastered the process of reading, she read in 4 languages. She wrote 13 books. She learned to speak. She graduated cum laude from Radcliffe College before women were allowed to attend Harvard. And I am just in awe of the accomplishments of this person. As Mark Twain said, she will be famous 1,000 years from now, as famous as she is today. And I have no doubt about that. This isn't a night for me to get up and talk about my research per se. I will spare you that. You've heard enough of this week already, and you'll certainly hear more. But indulge me a little bit and let me to begin by acknowledging, first of all of the entities that have supported my research over the year, and I'd like to acknowledge my wonderful departmental chairs. I've only ever had 2 in ophthalmology. These ophthalmologists are an enduring lot, starting with Bradley Stratzma, who was the founder of the Jules Stein Eye Institute, and now Bartley Mondino, his successor, an incredibly seamless transition from one chair to the next, and extraordinary supporters of fundamental research, the mother's milk of translational research. Don't ever forget that. Do not ever relent on the fundamental part of what we do. National Eye Institute, Macular Vision Research Foundation, Research to Prevent Blindness, and a lot of other private entities, including the Green family in Los Angeles, who sponsors, to this day, my endowed chair. Now, Gene Anderson, my dear friend, gave an introduction that included my agrarian background, and I'm very proud of that. Some of you may think that this might have been a rather stark existence. It wasn't. It was filled with wonderful stimuli from the environment, from the friends that I associated with. I wasn't privileged to establish a lot of social skills, having a student body of 6 or whatever that was up there. I didn't know how to call a girl on a telephone, and didn't until I got to college. I'd never seen a television show until I got to college. We didn't have television in South Dakota, in my part at least, and we did have a set in the local hardware store, which was on, but it was all snow. We had no stations. However, because there was no television, I did a lot of reading. And my teacher became frustrated because I had read all the books in the little library in this one-room schoolhouse. I had checked out as many Sugar Creek Gang books and what have you from the local library. And so she invited the superintendent one day to come by and see whether perhaps they could sort of rush me along a little bit. And so they did, and I skipped a grade. We didn't have kindergarten, and that's the reason why I started college at 16. I couldn't understand when I left for college, which was 1,000 miles away, why my mother was weeping. After all, I was a man, I thought. And I didn't see any reason why she should be distraught. But I can understand now, having children of my own. When I finished Calvin College, I moved out to California thinking I would be a high school teacher for the rest of my life. I was totally motivated, turned on, and ready to go, and couldn't understand why some of my students weren't quite as enthusiastic as I was. I was, after all, 3 years older than them, and that was a bit of a challenge. So as Gene said, the principal called me in one day and said, I want you to teach mathematics. And I said, I will not desecrate the field of mathematics. And I went to graduate school. And just before that, I married Audrey. And Audrey put me through graduate school. I couldn't believe my good fortune one day when I went to use the library at UCLA, not having applied there yet, and there was a bulletin board saying they would pay you to go to graduate school, $3,300 a year. I couldn't believe it. And so I signed up. And Audrey and I were married, and she took a job at the RAND Corporation, which is a think tank in Santa Monica, California. She worked for Daniel Ellsberg, the guy who did the Pentagon Papers. And he was a hawk in those days. He was a pro-Vietnam hawk when she worked for him. She also worked for James Schlesinger. Those of my vintage will recognize him as a former Secretary of Commerce and Defense. Quite an extraordinary experience for Audrey. So when I got to UCLA, I enrolled in courses, as we all did then, those PhD aspirants like myself, in the medical courses with the medical students, because after all, we were intended to go down a path where we would end up teaching medical students, so they felt we should take the same courses. And the guy who taught histology was Richard W. Young, who became my mentor. Now, I had secretly chosen him as my mentor, but I was scared to death of him. He was a former Marine sergeant. military bearing. He had entered the Army voluntarily, as he said, to prove that he was a man. And 6 weeks later, after he'd proved it, they wouldn't let him out. So he served 4 years, and then the Vietnam War broke out, and the Korean War broke out, and he got called up again. So after 6 years in the Marines, he was really motivated to get back to academics. And one day I was studying for a histology exam, and he walked in. I was alone in the room. He went to the blackboard. He was all business. He said, "I'm using radioisotopic tracers to study the biosynthesis of the capsule of the lens." In those days, we didn't know where it really came from, whether it was an accretion of proteins on the surface from the vitreous or what. Strode to the blackboard and said, "And I've noticed this strange phenomenon. I see this wave of radioactivity moving through the photoreceptor layer." Photoreceptors have these little antennae. For those who are lay people in the audience, and those little antennae absorb light. And he saw this wave of radioactivity moving through the antennae. And he said, "Would you like to work with me on this?" And I said to myself, yes. Because I wanted to learn how to use radioactive tracers. That was something I'd read about in Scientific American, and I was just ecstatic, and I accepted on the spot. And a lot of you in the room know the rest of the story. These photoreceptor cells that we have, that we're born with, we leave our mother's womb and they're already working. And if we live to be 100 years old, they keep working because they've discovered the fountain of youth. Every 10 days, you have a new antenna on every one of your rod photoreceptors if things go well. But as you know, things don't always go well. And we can develop retinitis pigmentosa, or age-related macular degeneration, or Stargardt macular dystrophy, or Usher syndrome. And then those antennae are lost, and the lights go out. So Helen Keller wanted us to do something about preventable blindness, and that's what we're trying to do. Now, the photoreceptors, like we urban dwellers, have a garbage disposal problem. They produce 100% of their antenna mass every 10 days, and they have to do something with it. Well, fortunately, there's a cell that lives right next door, and it's the garbage collector, and it's called the retinal pigment epithelium. And it eats 1/10 of each of our rod outer segments every day and digests it if things go well. Now, if you have Stargardt macular degeneration, which is a monogenic disease, and your pigment epithelium takes a bite of one of those photoreceptor pieces and eats it, it's eating a poison pill. And it takes into itself a byproduct of what we call the visual cycle, which is poisonous. It's a molecule called A2E, and it gets even more poisonous as it gets oxidized. And one of the people in the room tonight, Janet Sparrow, is one of the world's foremost experts on the biochemistry of this molecule, its toxicity, and she is one of the leaders in our understanding of how this turns out to the detriment of those who have not only Stargardt macular dystrophy, but we believe in some cases age-related macular degeneration itself. So this process of looking after our garbage is a stressful existence for the retinal pigment epithelium. And one example I'd like to give where this whole process runs amok came to our attention rather early. And again, it was John Dowling who kind of showed us the way. And let me say at this point that we scientists stand on the shoulders of all those who have gone before us. And we expand on the discoveries that were made before us. And there was this laboratory rat, which the English first introduced to us, called the Royal College of Surgeons rat. And John Dowling and Dick Sidman at Harvard had studied this rat. And when we looked at it, we thought, you know, that rat looks like it's got a garbage disposal problem. All the stuff that it's producing is collecting. Maybe the pigment epithelium isn't eating. Maybe it's not doing its job. And sure enough, that was the case. Now, we wanted to solve that, but we weren't smart enough. We wanted to know why. We displayed the phenomenon, but it took Matt LaValle, my good friend, and Douglas Vollroth, who are here tonight, working together as a geneticist and cell biologist to solve the problem. The problem was a mutation in a protein in the pigment epithelium that's not doing its job, and so it doesn't eat. And the rat photoreceptors die in their own heap of garbage. Human beings have a similar problem, a form of retinitis pigmentosa, caused by mutations in this gene that Doug and Matt revealed to us just a few years ago. So those are some examples of the things that we did rather early on. Regarding standing on people's shoulders, one of the subjects I've worked on began about 1880 in a German laboratory. The scientist was Willy Kuhne, and he noticed that if you looked at the retina of a laboratory animal that had been dark adapted, kept in the dark, and you examined this retina as you took it out of the animal, it was purple. And he noticed that when it was in the light, it would go from purple to colorless. And so he realized there was something there, and they called it visual purple, and we call it rhodopsin today, rhodopsin. And this is the light-capturing protein slash vitamin A, if you will, adduct that initiates vision in our eyes. So part of my career has been devoted to the question of how vitamin A, the precursor of this visual component of the visual pigment, how this vitamin A gets into the eye from our diet. It's a vitamin. We have to take it in to our diet. And John Dowling, when he was in the seminal stages of his career, worked out the biochemistry. This subject had been dormant for a long, long time, and John worked out the biochemistry, and we picked up the subject after that, and ultimately showed that vitamin A is delivered to the pigment epithelium by a protein that binds to the surface, binds to something called a receptor. And this is an example where Helen Keller could teach us a lesson in persistence, because we took a lot of flack for 30 years about that observation and whether it was real and meaningful, and finally, and we didn't have the tools to really consummate the deal. So fortunately, one of Jeremy Nathan's students was hired by my university, and he came to me one day and said, "I believe, let's work together." And we did. Hui's son and I cloned the DNA for this receptor, and my greatest retractor, a physical biochemist who publicly stood up and said she would never, ever believe that there was such a thing, sent me an email the next day after the paper appeared in Science as a research article, 2 words, Mazel Tov. So she's a believer now, too. Well, you know, I can tell you stories about times when I was wrong. I won't do that, of course. But I will say that this receptor turned out to be very important for human disease. There's a terrible syndrome called Matthew-Wood syndrome. When this gene is mutated for this receptor, the children are born with massive organ dysgenesis, tiny little eyeballs or no eyeballs at all. And so that, I think, points out ultimately the importance of this receptor molecule to human health. My colleagues Rando Alekmetz and Greg Hageman are in. I know Greg's in the room. I know Rando could be arriving late if he hasn't arrived already due to another obligation. They were involved in 2005 in the publication of a seminal paper along with 3 other independent laboratories that gave us the first good news about the genetics of age-related macular degeneration. AMD, if it were caused by a bacterium, could be called an epidemic in our society. In a country like ours where we live, women live to be 82 on the average, men 76, 77. It's an epidemic. Over the age of 75, 30% of us have some form of AMD. And in the audience, of course, we have Rick Ferris and Emily Chu, who are the major investigators in the so-called AREDS trials. You read articles or you watch television nowadays, you see people advertising this elixir of vitamins and antioxidants that you can take to slow down the process. And the thing that Greg and Rando and the 3 other labs did was pinpointed one of the molecules that is really, really important in the etiology of AMD, and it's called, the molecule is called complement factor H. It's part of our immune system, our inborn immune system. And we're working to try to understand the mechanisms whereby this happens. And very, very grateful that I have wonderful colleagues like Roxana Radu and Gabe Travis. And more recently, we've teamed up with John Dowling and Tom Jordan, who's with us tonight, to see if we can come up with some small molecule therapies that might address. And I know Greg is working on this too. Many people are working on this from many avenues. Now some final thoughts. I've been in this for a long time, this business, and I early on became associated with the Foundation Fighting Blindness. It was then called the Retinitis Pigmentosa Foundation. And one day, they invited a bunch of us to attend a meeting which was held in Canada, sponsored by the Canadian and American foundations. These were the best people in vision science at the time, people working on retina and things of that nature, related nature. I remember the Canadian president of that foundation telling us, "You will not leave this building until we see the white puffs of smoke coming from the chimney," conjuring up an analogy with the Vatican. Well, we didn't have a clue. Retinitis pigmentosa sounded like an inflammatory disease, which it's not. Blood vessel attenuation really doesn't have anything to do with that in the primary sense. A brilliant young physical biochemist from Hopkins named appropriately Richard Cohn, cones are our color photoreceptors, said, "I think it might have something to do with rhodopsin." And we all snickered. You know, this bright guy, naive, doesn't know anything about clinical stuff. Well, he turned out to be right. 1989, Peter Humphreys published the gene association on chromosome 1. In 1990, Ted Drija, Elliot Burson published the first rhodopsin mutation, P23H. Ironically, it doesn't exist much in Ireland. This Irish guy apparently migrated to the United States, waxed plentifully, and that's the most common mutation we have in America. So I was there at the beginning of that. I have seen so many things happen. Probably one of the more satisfying things was the very first really successful gene trial. And it happened in vision. And it happened in the context of a condition called Leber congenital amaurosis. In 1998, I collaborated with Mike Redmond, Grosley Crouch, Duko Hamasaki on the knockout of the gene responsible for this, called RPE65. And 10 years later, we had our first human clinical trial. So that shows you how the pace is building up. Corey Haas, treated at the age of 8, couldn't negotiate a maze, and he now plays baseball catch with his father and rides a bicycle. Folks, I would say that we've seen the first puffs of white smoke, and I would say that it's starting to billow, and it's looking, I think, very promising for all of us. Thank you so much to the Helen Keller and Bright Focus Foundation for this tremendous honor, and thank you all for coming.